And now, Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to Deborah Kobylt Live today. Did you love the show Moonlighting, or do you? Because I've been watching it myself lately. Well, we have the author of a terrific book. His name is Scott Ryan, Moonlighting, an Oral History. Fantastic book. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. It's very exciting.
So are we, and this motivated my husband and I to start watching Moonlighting again, right? Got our YouTube, we put it on the TV, and we've been just watching episode after episode. And it reminded me of what a truly phenomenal show it is and was. And for many reasons, right? The writer, the actors. And what's great about this book is, as you call it, an oral history, you go and speak to many of the people who worked on that show. To talk about Moonlighting and what went on behind the scenes, the good stuff, and even the stuff like why it ended, right? Let's talk about why you even decided to write this book in the first place.
Well, moonlighting influenced me as a writer. It made me want to be a writer when I was 15 and I started the show. So it's always been in the back of my mind as a book I wanted to do. So I asked Glenn if I could do this in 2015 because I got to interview him for my podcast, and he wasn't too thrilled about the idea. It kind of blew me off.
Hang on,
Then
let's tell everybody who's Glenn.
Glenn Gordon Caron is the creator of Moonlighting and pretty much wrote every episode. I mean, there's other writers, but they all went through Glenn's typewriter in the end. And he's gone on to do a ton of shows, including Medium with Patricia Arquette. And I didn't have any reason for him to trust me. I had no books under my name. But after I finished my Letterman book and it kind of did well, I thought this is my opportunity. So I contacted Glenn again. I sent him my Letterman book and he responded pretty quickly and said, you know what, let's do this. And so he opened the doors to all the writers, the producers, and the actors.
The Letterman book you're referring to is about David Letterman and the last 6 months of his show, right?
Right. Yeah, it was wrapping up Dave's career on late night television. It's the same type of book where I interviewed everyone and then I pieced their interviews together as if you're just sitting in the room with all these people and they're commenting on each other, even though that's not how I did the interviews at all.
Yeah, it's wonderful. You also did a book on 30 something. Let's tell people.
Yeah, yep. 30 something was my first television book. And I've come a long way since then. There, I'm not in the book as much. With each book, I insert myself more because I'm getting more confident as a writer.
Right, more confident as a writer, and people are getting way more confident with you. I'd say now you've proven yourself. And before I let you go at the end of the show, you're going to tell me what you'd love to work on next. Um,
Yes.
but let's talk a little bit about Moonlighting, because let's face it, it was such a different show. And having just seen the very first episode again, um, it was a beautiful show. And those two characters were different than any other characters, right, that were on TV. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, David Addison changed the way all men played characters. And I'm not even just saying that flippantly. I mean, before Bruce Willis came to television, you didn't have this charismatic man that also was funny, but also pouted. I mean, David Addison's feelings got hurt. I mean, you never saw Magnum PI or Blake Carrington pouting through their hours of television. But David Addison was more of a real man. He had all the aspects of it. You go to Sybil Shepherd, she owned the business. This is in the middle of the 80s, and she's the boss, not to go with who's the boss. But it was a big deal to have a woman running a business, and she fought with David Addison. She was not just pushed aside. She was the star of the show. She, as Sybil likes to say, she got top billing, and that was one of the first times in her career and only times it happened.
Some people might not know that Bruce was so not known, right? Before he started that show. What was he doing before he started? Because he sort of walked into that first episode like he owned it too. And I thought, gosh, for a guy who didn't have an awful lot of experience and playing opposite her, she was like a megastar. That took a lot of guts, right?
Well, and they said that he had it in the audition. The first chapter of my book really goes through the casting process, and it's one of the most famous casting calls ever of them trying to find this guy that could, as you say, stand next to Sybil Shepherd and be cocky. You know, for most people, that's going to be a hard thing to do. Bruce Willis really had nothing to his name. I mean, he was like an understudy in one off Broadway show. Beyond that, he was a bartender. But he had this thing that Glenn Gordon Caron saw when he came into the audition. It's a fun part of the book because everyone talks about this audition. And some people say he jumped up on the table. Some people say he stood on a filing cabinet. What really happened, we don't know. But it's fun to get everyone's perspective on it.
Did Sybil also, she gave you her perspective? Because I know she's in this book, which is
Right.
wonderful, people, because you'll get Sybil Shepherd's perspective throughout the book as well. I know that you tried getting Bruce, but he was unavailable. He's always working, always busy. But, you've got Glenn, you've got a lot of the background characters. And by that, I mean, not just the actors, but the people who work behind the scenes too. But I love how there's a different accounting of what happened, right? It's like a game of telephone with all the people in the room, right?
Right. It's especially like an example is the budget of the Atomic Shakespeare episode, which was, what Moonlighting's very famous for. Everyone I interviewed, I said, what was the budget for on that show? And then when I do the book, I list it in order and someone's like, 100,000, 500,000, 2 million, 4 million, and it just keeps growing. The point was it was the most expensive episode of all time. Bruce really wanted to do the book. We set up 6 different interviews. He just canceled everyone right before it happened. So I had a deadline to meet. But Sybil is in the book, and I probably talked to her maybe 14 times.
Yeah. What was that like, meeting with her? What was she like?
First of all, she is so sweet and so kind. I was a nervous wreck the first time, but she was just a regular person. I mean, it was crazy. I think it took me a year and a half to get the first interview with her. I kept going back and forth with her people. And then finally, one day they just said, Sybil's in. And I said, okay, is she going to call me? And they're like, no, here's her home phone number. And I'm like, what? And I just called, and there's Sybil Shepherd answering the phone. We ended up becoming really good friends and talking all the time. And we even watched a couple episodes of Moonlighting together.
Oh, I love that. I really love that. I also love in your book when you talk about when Glenn, again, the writer, first sat down with Sybil when he was even considering this show, right? How they were just sweating it out. But same story. She was sort of a regular gal, even though she had been so well known, which I love how they wrote that into the script, right? Because how do you
Right.
get around something like that? It's Sybil Shepherd. So you might as well just say, well, she was famous in the show too. You know what I mean? I love
Right.
that.
Yeah, they used a lot of her actual modeling pictures in the background. They hang on her wall because obviously she's Sybil Shepherd.
You know, the dialogue was so fast. I mean, sometimes I was like, wait, what do they say? Was that intentional?
Yes, they kind of based it off Bringing Up Baby. If there's
Mm.
any old movie fans out there, they screened that movie. Bob Butler directed the pilot. He's a very famous television pilot director, and they screened that movie. Sybil already knew a lot about that because she had lived with Peter Bogdanovich, and
Mm.
she talks in the book that he showed her a famous old movie every night. And so she knows, I mean, when we were talking, she's just dropping these actors' names left and right. It was really fun. What did you think?
Yeah.
You're watching, you said you and your husband watched some episodes. How did you feel they held up?
Oh, better than ever. Sometimes when you look at something that you watched some time ago and you watch it again, you sort of marvel and say, wow, that was even more spectacular than I remember. Like the black and white issue, I
Oh,
couldn't
yeah.
I mean, I kind of couldn't take my eyes off her because she's not just very beautiful, but she's so smart. She's smart, and that comes across in everything she does. But also David, Bruce. I also was a little stunned that he had the guts to go up against her, and he was so snide. And I thought that must have been tough to do, but that's also a little bit of him. He plays a little bit of that in all of his characters. Do you know what I mean? And I thought he brought so much to make her look good, but he also really stole the show too from episode 1, don't you think?
Well, he did for me as a 15-year-old boy when I watched that. He was such a smart mouth. And that meant a lot to me because obviously, when you're a teenage boy, you think you know the world. And David Addison, in fact, I think one of the writers describes David Addison as the ultimate teenage boy. And
Mm.
he pretty much is. But yeah, that black and white episode is so classic, and it's always put on the list of the best hours of television. And, I wish these were out on streaming services or Blu-ray or something, because they deserve to be. So, tell Disney you want to see Moonlighting, because they own it.
Oh, good to know. Um, Tell people a little more about that Shakespeare episode. I mean, that must have taken, I think, sort of forever to shoot. Again, you mentioned how you heard there were different budgets for it, but when I watched that, I thought, my God, how do they do this? How many takes must they have had for something like that, you know?
Well, the thing that is insane about that episode is from concept to airing, it's like 18 days. Now, normally a TV show, any TV show, is filmed 2, 3 months before we ever see it. But they had to turn around really quickly because ABC wanted it for sweeps. And
Ah,
so they start, like, they get the idea on like November 4th, and it airs like November 28th. I mean, I don't have those dates exactly right, but close enough. So that's
mm,
why it's the most expensive episode of television up to that point. It's not because of the costumes, it's because they shot it with 3 crews at the same time.
ah,
So they're filming all day long with all A units. There were no B and C units. They just were all filming. So they said that rarely Sybil and Bruce, they're not in any scenes together because one's over there shooting and one's over here shooting. So I think,
interesting.
yeah, it's crazy. It's a really amazing way to make television, and then for it to turn out good. Like, you would think the end of that story is, the episode's not really that great because they threw it together, but that's not the way it was at all. It's certainly one of the classic episodes.
Now, tell people who might not remember, how many seasons did we have of Moonlighting?
So there's 5 seasons. The first season is a mid-season replacement, which I don't even know if that even exists in television anymore, because TV kind of happens year round now. But they only made a handful of episodes every year because they just couldn't keep the pace up. So that's another crazy part in the book, is hearing these writers talk about, they're writing it, they're shooting it out, it's going down to the set, they're filming it right then. Like, the scripts were like 15 minutes old before they're shooting it. So I think that is all of that spontaneity that you feel. Sybil and Bruce didn't have hours to learn these lines. They were getting them, they were memorizing them, and just shooting it right then.
Man, that always amazes me because any play that I was ever in, I had the hardest time memorizing any lines. And when I look at that dialogue and the way they deliver it, like it's coming right out of their mouth and they wrote it and thought about it, that amazed me as well. I mean, that's a real skill, I have to say. That's a skill that a lot of us don't have. I don't.
I
Um,
certainly wouldn't either. I mean, it's so impressive to think about it. Now, Sybil does say whenever they're in the car that there are probably lines scotch taped on 3x5 cards wherever you can't see it. But I mean,
you gotta do what you gotta do, right? I mean,
right.
really. Um, who sort of impressed you the most as you were going about your research? Again, you spoke to many of the writers. Like, what really stuck with you that you can tell our audience? And I like to tease the book and get them excited. I don't, I don't even mind sometimes if we have a little bit of a spoiler alert, because then it's like, oh my God, I got to pick up the book.
Well, and I really do think, and I realize I wrote the book, but I wrote it so long ago that it's like someone else did. But for me, it's the story of the collapse of the series where this book really starts to take flight. And there is a writer, Roger Director, he worked on St. Elsewhere or Hill Street Blues, like shows, really big shows. And he came over to work on Moonlighting. And he was really put in charge of season 4, where the show sort of comes apart because Sybil is pregnant in real life. She's on bed rest because she's pregnant with twins. Bruce is off making a little film. You probably hadn't heard of it, but it was called Die Hard. I don't know. It's, just a real small film. And they're all coming apart. Well, when I talked to Roger, this is 30 years ago, he still feels the weight of quote unquote ruining Moonlighting. You could hear it in his voice because he was left in charge while Glenn went off to make Clean and Sober with Michael Keaton. They all were going in different places. And, he feels that burden, but I felt like I was there to absolve him of this and say, look, you did the best. Nobody could do a show where you don't have the two leads together. I mean, that's insane. So you'll find out how that all worked, and you really do feel the pain of that season.
A lot of people were claiming, now the audience I'm talking, that they heard there was a lot of infighting. Was there or wasn't there? Again, spoiler alerts are welcome.
Right. There was. I mean, there's no way around it. There was. Bruce and Sybil fought all the time. Sybil admits it. She says, we fought before we were going to fight on screen. But it's interesting because so many people ask me, did they hate each other? And that's a different question. I don't think they hated each other. I think that it was such a pressure cooker. I mean, imagine, like you just said, all that fast dialogue and you just get it. And you could maybe do that once, but now imagine doing that for 5 years. It's gonna weigh on you. And so I think that's what it was. I think they love each other now. Glenn and Sybil have some huge fights in the book, but they're friends now. Everyone came out of it okay.
They certainly did. I mean, maybe in the moment emotionally it wasn't okay, but they did all come out of it okay. Yeah, and just also, Glenn's end to the show was disappointing as well to him. I mean, it was just, do you want to give anything away? I don't like to give anything away, but if you want to, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, it is public record. I think people just have forgotten. But I mean, basically, Sybil made the claim, it's either me or Glenn. And, as Glenn says, you're not going to beat the good-looking model over the schlubby writer. I mean, ABC, it's not going to be a rough choice for them. So it is a heartbreaking ending to somebody who had so much to do with the show. And, whether it's to me, it's fascinating because now we live in a time of Me Too where all these women are coming out about how they were treated. And I think looking back, it had to be really hard for Sybil to be the only woman in a boys' club. And that show was without a doubt a boys' club. Now, it doesn't mean that it was necessarily toxic because of the sexual aspect of it. But I think that it was toxic because of the amount of work they had to do in the short amount of time.
I have a quote that I'm going to read from Sybil, so if I can find it. It's about chemistry. Here we go. The one thing I learned very early on about chemistry between actors is if you have chemistry with an actor, the last thing you want to do is act on it because familiarity can breed contempt. What happened with those two? What do you think? What do you think happened? What happened personally with those two?
Well, she said when she first met Bruce, the temperature went up 10 degrees. And there is no doubt Bruce Willis was damn good looking. Sybil Shepherd was damn good looking. I mean, that's why the show was successful. We want to think of all these other things, but honestly, those were two really good looking people. Sybil did very freely. I did not have to twist her arm to bring it up. She does talk about an evening with a bottle of Jack Daniels, a lazy boy chair, and Bruce and her. And, I'll leave that up to people to go out and get the book at scottryanproductions.com to get that whole story. But
I'm going to add to it a little bit.
Yes, ma'am.
They do start making out. Now, now hang on a minute. And just how far they go, now you go get the book because yes, they did. They were making out and it was hot and heavy. As I was reading it, I'm like, oh my God. So
what's funny about that is Sybil told me that story on our very first phone call together. So, she was very open there. It wasn't, and I think that's why we needed these 30 years. There's never been a book about moonlighting till this one, which has always amazed me. But I think it took this long to heal all those wounds.
Yeah. I mean, talk about perspective. Let's face it, with time, you get your perspective, right? People cool off, they step away. they've raised families and kids, and they look back at what was amazing and what could have been its downfall. Let's talk a little bit about how her character and how she created, and also the writers, such a strong female character for its time, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, and it was interesting because when I talked to Sybil about this,
Yeah.
she really didn't want to hear it. And I thought it was interesting for all of her iconic status. I think she thinks of herself as just a Southern girl, not some feminist icon.
Yeah. Well, sometimes as you're going through something and you get that label, you don't even see it because you're just going to work. She went to work and she created the character as it was written, but also as she saw the character. But that's interesting that you told me that. I didn't quite realize that. But, it says here, Sybil Shepherd created one of the strongest, most well-rounded female characters of that decade and probably the next decade. She was also caught in the middle, as you talked about, as the boys at the boys club. But she really did, because it's funny. I think before her, right, there was Mary Tyler Moore, right? I think that was I don't recall
Sure.
when that was out,
but in the 70s, yeah.
And that was certainly a strong female character. I remember looking at that in later years, thinking I don't quite relate to her. But Sybil, I really did, because I don't know, because I guess because I'm a reporter, right? And reporters have to sort of like barrel into a room. And I really got her. I'm like, oh, you have guts. I love it. So she did speak for a whole bunch of us who were starting out in the news business, by the way.
Right.
She really did. Yeah.
Well, and when you go back to those old movies, like with Katharine Hepburn, and she was really strong, and then that faded away from movies. I don't want to take anything away from the Mary Tyler Moore show. It's classic. I love Mary Tyler Moore.
Oh my God.
But
the
Lou
whole
Grant
thing
does push her around. I mean, that's part of that era. And
yeah.
I do think that Sybil was one of the first women that really stood toe to toe with her male counterpoint. If you look at Dynasty, which is playing at the same time, I mean, Joan Collins just plays a bitch. She's not well rounded. You feel for Sybil. Sybil is not the villain. You love Maddie and you love David, and it's an equal one-on-one. And that
you do.
And that's been forgotten in television. Even now, they forget and they want to lean it one way. Now it's almost going where you have these female characters that are so strong, and they're forgetting you got to bring the male along. The best idea is to do the show 50-50.
What a great point. I didn't think about it that way, that, but you've been living with this. So you do. That's actually a very clever point. You're right, because they both had, even though she was the big star, particularly in the beginning, they both on screen seem to have equal billing, in my opinion. And that's how I look at
it. And, every episode is a case that involves their relationship. I mean, that's really what it's about. And the writer said, we wanted you to see Dave's point of view. You want to see Maddie's point of view. And that's why we all loved it, because you want to argue about it. And, when you're watching the black and white episode with your husband, you might say, oh, I think she did it. And he might say, I think he did it. And you have a little bit of an argument, and they don't give you the answer. They respected the audience.
They respected the audience, but they ended up showing you both scenarios, which I thought was so clever. What a clever episode. People really go look it up. So hang on a minute. I want to look up something else about them sort of doing it, right? And it being written into the show. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think that did to the show?
Well, that is what I said in my opening essay. I talk about how if Moonlighting is famous for anything, it's famous for what's called the Moonlighting curse, which means when you get two characters together, their show fails. So you look at Friends, and we have 10 years of Will Ross and Rachel get together. I mean, that's stupid. In my entire adult life, I've never met one other adult that told somebody they loved them, but, oh, we're not going to get together. Does she love you? Yeah, she loves me and I love her, but we're not going to get together. And this happens in TV all the time. And they trace it back to Moonlighting, because they say once Dave and Maddie said I love each other and had sex in the highest rated episode the show ever had, then everyone says the show went downhill. But those two things don't always go together.
Well, so how that goes. Yeah, go ahead. like,
Well,
oh, well, as she said, familiarity would breed contempt in that case. But
right.
go ahead, please.
And so I wanted to get to the bottom. Is that really that simple? They had sex and then the show was over. And what you find out is that's when Sybil got pregnant. That's when Bruce got Die Hard. That's when Glenn got Clean and Sober, the show. So all of those things played a part. And I think I like to think this book is a complex look at a very complex problem. It's not so simple as two characters have sex. That means the show's over.
No, there are so many people involved. Here's another, you know what I love, just as an aside. I wanted to make sure I mentioned it because I actually laughed out loud when I read this in your book. One of the people who worked, Melissa, says, I worked in the office and we would get calls from people who would need help on a case and they needed Maddie and David. There were a couple of times when people called with real problems. You know, I'd have to be really nice and say, I'm sorry, but this is a TV show. Right? I mean, people like, what were they doing? Instead of calling an agency, they would call like over at ABC and say, hello, I'd like to speak to the people at Moonlighting. They couldn't have been serious, or were they? I mean,
no,
wow.
she said it happened. It wasn't just a one time. And what it fascinated me, this is how much television has changed. I mean, this show was huge. I mean, not just, we're talking Super Bowl ratings every week. I think it would be hard for someone in 2020 to consider how big the ratings were. They said when the show ended, they always got phone calls because it was just a small company. They were their own company, and people would say right away, I didn't like that this happened. I want them to get together and all these things. And can you imagine calling Game of Thrones now? The guy who wrote Game of Thrones, I'm like, more dragons, please. I need lots more dragons. It's just crazy.
If there would be somebody answering the phone, that would be a miracle, number one, right? So, but you know, that episode where they, you know, got together, it's kind of like the I Dream of Jeannie effect, right? You know, you're watching Tony and Jeannie every week, and it's like, oh, get it on already. You know what I mean? Do you have any idea whatever happened to those ratings, or you don't know when that happened? Like after they got it on?
I actually don't know. I don't know that ratings drove television back in the 60s as much as it did in the 80s, where, you know, and that's the other part of Moonlighting is the money aspect starts to come into television. Moonlighting is the first show that ABC owned and aired. Now, every Netflix show, they own it, they air it. HBO owns it, they air it. And this became a whole new thing. And Moonlighting is just the beginning of it, where the networks were dipping their toes into this idea. How can we double dip and make even more money? And I think that's why Moonlighting got to do all these crazy episodes, because they had deep pockets. But then the network came in and was like, oh, we could own Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and spend no money and make all this money. And so this is the beginning of reality TV sort of coming in as well.
Yeah, and the networks owning anything. And also, let's remember, it was at a time where there really only were 3 major networks, and then of course the side networks, if you will, right? But it was at a time where that's really that's the only choice you kind of had, was to watch certain channels at night. And it was at night. At the same time, because I don't know, were you able to record things back then? I don't even remember.
I mean, I actually recorded on my Beta. Hello, millennials. Beta, look it up. But yeah, you could, but it was, you know, there was no TiVo, there weren't things like that. So
right. So what's your favorite episode?
Well, I have 2. It's hard for me to just pick one. I love Big Man on Mulberry Street because that's the episode where they dance for 7.5 minutes to a Billy Joel song. And it happens to be my favorite Billy Joel song. So it was like a perfect collision for me. But my honest to goodness one is called A Womb with a View. It's Glenn Gordon Caron's last episode. It's his goodbye to the series. And I've always loved this episode. When I started to do the book, I did some research and found out that on Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb, it is considered the lowest liked
Oh,
episode of all of Moonlighting. And I guess fans really hate it. And I was like, should I be doing a book when my favorite episode is fans' least favorite episode? But, what are you going to do? I'm not like everyone else.
tell people, because you talk to an awful lot of people in the book, how did everyone feel when it was suddenly over? The ones who worked on it, was there relief? Was there sadness? Was there depression? I mean, what happened? Because that's a long time to be living
Right.
with people. You know that. Tell me.
No, they were heartbroken, and they
Yeah.
still are. They were so close, the crew. And it's interesting because a lot of people will say, oh, you didn't get Bruce Willis, well, the book must not be any good. And I'm like, hey, I got that Melissa assistant who answered the phones. This book is great. Like, those are the people that were in it. I mean, Bruce came to work and did his lines and went home. I'm talking to the people that made this show happen, that really create it, the editors who are in the editing bay. And like, the editor tells a story about losing a reel of an episode, and it's a crazy story. So
Do you want to tell? Can you tell people?
Well,
Would you?
yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable. So they were always editing right to the last minute. I mean,
Right.
ABC wouldn't know, and this show has to end tomorrow, and they're doing these reels and they're sending them off because it was actual film. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but they actually did reels of film. So
Right.
they send it over to the lab and it's edited, and then they call and they say, hey, I thought you were sending 2 reels. And he's like, yeah, I did. And they're like, well, we got 1. And he's like, what are you talking about? So I think they're all start looking around. They're talking to the driver and everything. About 45 minutes later, this guy comes up to the studio with a reel that says Moonlighting and turns it in. He was a homeless guy who just found this reel of Moonlighting rolling down Sunset Boulevard.
Oh my
And he
God.
thought, I guess this belongs to you. The editor ran into Glenn Gordon Cairn's office and said, give me $200. And he's like, what? And he's like, I got to give this guy just saved all of our lives. And otherwise that film would have been totally gone.
And it's stories like that are throughout your book.
And
Absolutely.
it's because you get the people who really made it. I mean, it's great to have Sybil and Curtis Armstrong and Elise Beasley. They're the stars of the show. But you honestly, and I found this out in my Letterman book, like I interviewed the HR lady, and you're going to get these stories that you don't get everywhere else.
We don't have a lot of time to talk about that book, but as you know, in my household, Letterman is, we love him. And my husband read your Letterman book even before he knew I was interviewing you. He's like, oh my God, I love that book. Same thing, right? How you went about crafting that book, right? Tell me a little bit about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I hunted down Barbara Gaines over Twitter. I hounded her for about a year and just kept asking her, can I get an interview? Can I get an interview? And I think I wore her down. And when we had the first interview, she was a little reticent because she wasn't sure what I was going to go for. Because my books are not about the gossip and the salacious part.
Yeah.
And I didn't even ask her any questions about David Letterman. I just wanted to know about her job, scheduling, the final 6 weeks. You have George Clooney, Oprah Winfrey, President Obama. I mean, Al Pacino does a walk-on. We're talking about the biggest celebrities of all time.
Ever.
How do you manage that and send off this legend in 28 episodes? And we bonded and had a great interview. And she said, who you need to talk to is this person. And then that person led me to that person. And, it just keeps going. And you will find out how they did these episodes for fans like your husband, who, like me, just loved Letterman. This is a great inside look at it. It's called The Last Days of Letterman.
Yeah, but to your point, you don't really get into the nitty gritty, dark gossip in any of your books. You sort of approach it as a curious fan, I think. Like, gosh, how'd you do that? How'd you make that happen? And that's what's interesting to most of us, right? The backstory of it all. and it's, you sort of leave there feeling, aha, so that's how it went, instead of feeling like, see, told you, you know, and which is what is terrific about the books that you've written, because you really got a true inside look whilst keeping it all sort of positive, right?
Right. Well, to me, it's about your job. And,
Yeah.
like your job is interesting. You have to interview these people and look at you pretending you're interested in what I wrote. You're doing a great job.
Wait a minute, but I am. So hang on a minute. To the point where I was like obsessively watching stuff, but I get what you're saying. It's like
But I
I
mean,
totally
that's
get
the thing.
yeah.
Like what you do is interesting to someone who doesn't do that. And
Right.
and it's just it doesn't matter what people's jobs are, like someone who can build a cabinet. Like I can't build a cabinet. How'd you build a cabinet? And that is how I approach all of my interviews. Is I don't want to know what's the worst part of your life. I want to know what was the best part. When were you using every skill that you have, and how did that make you feel? Because that to me is so much more interesting than the bottom part of life.
Absolutely. Now, what are you working on next? Because I know you also have a publishing company. And what is your like absolute, gosh, I'd love to do this book?
Well, my next book is actually done. I actually finished it 2 days
Ah,
ago. So that's very exciting. It's The Fire Walk with Me, which is right behind me, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. That's my next book. It's coming out in May. So right now I don't have a project, but if I could have any project in the world, is this showing up? Are we getting Ally McBeal here?
you want
So,
Ally McBeal? Oh, what a phenomenal show. Oh my gosh.
so I love David E. Kelley. He's my favorite writer. And I just think that Ally McBeal, in the same way of Moonlighting, it's actually interesting. Alan Arkish is a director on Moonlighting and Ally McBeal. And in the book, he said that twice he felt he stepped into the zeitgeist, once with Moonlighting and once with Ally McBeal. And
I'll
I think
bet.
Ally represents the 90s in such a way that Moonlighting represented the 80s. So I just love Ally. So that is my dream book that I'm going to try to start working on now, but you always need that in. So if David E. Kelley's out there, I'm waiting for you.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got all these great books behind you now, and you also have proven that, you're into it for the fan of the show. And that's a great thing. So I have a feeling that that's going to be one of your next books. So that's wonderful. Any parting words for our audience? I love talking to you. And by the way, people, I've been watching Moonlighting on YouTube. That's how I've been getting it. But it would be great if Disney put them out, because it's so wonderful to see them again and to study it from a different perspective, from the perspective of 2021. Right. Even just how they
Right.
shoot things, just the different shots, like you're putting on a sweater and then they go to the bottom of the sweater and your hands. Things are just shot differently too. Right.
Yeah, I am so excited that you're watching this, and I have been on Glenn to get this out on Blu-ray or get it streaming. The music is what's holding everything
Yes.
up. So Disney just needs to pay Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones and Darlene Love and all of the rest of them, and let's get this out.
Yeah.
Parting words is, man, just do what you want in life. Go for your dreams. I was sitting in a corporate office 5 years ago, and now I'm running this company. I'm writing books that I want to do. It's not easy, but whatever's supposed to be easy is not worth it. So if you want to go out to scottryanproductions.com, you can find out all of my projects and support the books that I've done.
Wonderful, wonderful work. I'm a big fan of yours now. And thank you for calling us from my hometown in Sarasota, Florida. When I heard you were down there, I'm like, yay.
So where should my wife and I go to dinner tonight?
Epicure. That's one of my favorites. I can't help it. That's downtown, right on, the corner of Main Street and I think Palm. See how well I know my little Sarasota?
Yeah,
So
and I've
enjoy
never
yourself.
been there. So I bet we're going to go because we need somewhere good to go tonight. So
And text me a photo. No, really, it's one of my favorite. I love that restaurant. It is my favorite restaurant in all of Sarasota. You'll make me so happy. Anyway,
okay,
thank
what
you
should
so
I
much.
get? I mean, I know I'm taking time, but do you have a suggestion? Because we're
Um,
going. I'm not kidding.
Anything. Their pastas are great, but if you're not into
Oh,
the pastas, I love their chicken that they sort of absorb into their salad, but I don't remember the name of it.
okay.
But their
All right.
entire menu, yeah, they have gelato too, for dessert. It's
Ooh.
wonderful.
right,
Enjoy
we're
yourself.
going.
And I love the fact that you came on to talk about this. There's a lot in this book, people. So pick it up. Moonlighting and Oral History with Scott Ryan. And we'll put all of his information also on our social media. So thanks so much for joining us, Scott. Have a
Thank you.
great dinner tonight from Sarasota. Say hi to say hi to Sybil for me, and we'll get her on next time.
Yes.
And yeah, and thanks everybody for joining us on Deborah Kobylt Live. You can find us everywhere. We're on YouTube, on Facebook, IGTV, and then we download it for the audio version of our podcast. It's on iHeartRadio, and honestly, anywhere else that you get your podcast, you'll find us. So thanks for supporting us.